presentation, Thinking Like an Economist, and we're looking at part 1. We're only doing part of the first section of the reading. This is the first day of 3. Every profession has its professional language. These are ways that professionals can use to communicate with one another in such a way so there is no misunderstandings or no ambiguity. And many different professions have their own professional language. For example, if you're a mathematician, you have very strange words like integrals and axioms and vector spaces, things I have absolutely no knowledge about. Negative, negative, the square root of -1. I mean, none of it makes sense. But the mathematicians who have their own universe, it does make sense. Psychologists have their own vocabulary as well. You might remember this if you took AP psychology or regular psychology. The ideas of id and ego and superego, cognitive dissonance, which probably most of you are feeling right now. If you're in law, well, you got a lot of stuff like the idea of something being promissory. That's a legal principle that if a premise is enforceable by law, when a promise is made, it has to be done. Estoppel, torts, venues. I didn't even know what estoppel means. I looked that up. Torts sounds like a type of pastry, but is a type of case that you put in trial. Venues are where they're done. But again, it's their own language, and based on my own ignorance of certain of these words, it's a language that maybe only they understand. Even education has its professional language. And jogi, can't even say it. Does anyone know what that is? That's any form of adult learning. So when someone goes to adult school, that's a word that they use. Brainstorming, you all know about that one. Rubric, another one of our professional language. And of course, senioritis. So brace yourself, it is coming. It's not the same when you're at home, but it's coming. I think it's already hit one or two of you already. You're tired, you don't want to do this anymore. Economics has its own vocabulary as well. Words like supply, opportunity cost. You see, a month ago, you didn't know what opportunity cost meant. Now, it really has a meaning to you. You're speaking or thinking like an economist already. Elasticity, which you might not learn about. That's from chapter 5. Consumer surplus, demand, comparative advantage, and so on and so on and so forth. Mankiw then goes on to try to convince the reader that economists are scientists. And from his point of view, are scientists in the way that we think of science in relation to a physicist or a chemist, a biologist, or a doctor. Now, there is a great deal of controversy about this. There are many schools of thought who say the idea that economics is a hard science is just a lot of nonsense. And that's a debate that we might be able to explore. But we're taking Mankiw's point of view. We don't have to agree with this. I do not agree with this 100%, but it's important to understand where they come from and where the majority of economists come from, because by understanding their mindset, you'll understand their assumptions, and thus you can understand what they have to say a little bit more informed. So, Mankiw, in his own words, proves, or to his own satisfaction, that economists are scientists because of the training that it gives you. First of all, he argues that economists think in terms of alternatives. There is more than one way, for example, that a tax cut could affect the people, and we as economic scientists must be able to anticipate not just one of these alternatives, but the many, many different alternatives that are out there. He argues that you are trained as an economist to evaluate the cost of individual and social choices. How much would it cost, let us say, the middle-class family for a major tax cut that only helps 1% of the earning population? What is the individual and social cost of, for example, giving a guaranteed income to people, more welfare, rent control, rising the money supply, and so forth? With any luck, economists are consistent. He also argues that it trains you to examine and understand how certain events and issues are related. Economics is sort of like, a great fabric. Everything stitched together from bits and pieces of the past, the events going on right now. The economists themselves then, because of their training, can figuratively pull on the threads to see the individual parts that make it up. By understanding how events and issues are related, then, an economist can make better decisions and hopefully be able to impart that and turn it into policy. Mankiw argues that there is a specific economic way of thinking, that as scientists, they have to think in a different way, just like a mathematician has to think in certain ways when they're doing the math that they're doing, or a biologist has to think in certain ways. So do economists. He argues that the economic way of thinking means thinking analytically, objectively. Analytically means just looking at the facts, not putting things emotionally. Because if you put emotion into it, like, how will it affect, the feelings of this group or that group, that's not part of their job. Objectively is to try to look as closely as possible with how things as they really and truly are. Whether or not people can really do that is another story. Mankiw definitely believes that we can do that. He argues that the economic way of thinking includes the use of the scientific method. Now, this perhaps is one of the least powerful arguments by Mankiw, considering that economists cannot directly experiment. You cannot, for example, take a group of people, of young people, give them money, and a group of people and not give them money and see which ones die of malnutrition first. You cannot do that. Although there are some elements of the scientific method that economists use. He argues that an economic way of thinking that an economist is trained in teaches you to use abstract models to help explain how a complex real world operates. And we're going to be looking at models a little bit later. This is perhaps one of the newest controversies out there. A recent book has come out that attempts to completely destroy the idea that abstract models are actually helpful in economics. And last, for the economic way of thinking, he argues they're scientists because they develop theories, they collect and analyze data to evaluate the theories that they come up with. Again, there's a problem with the validity of the theories and the data that they have, but that's another story too. The economist, a scientist, assumes that assumptions are a big part of the profession. They make assumptions in order to make the world easier to understand. Let's come to an understanding what is meant by an assumption. As you can see here from the business directory over to the left, an assumption is a belief, logical construct, or unconfirmed fact. So, for example, if I see someone coming towards me and that person is dressed in a skirt, blonde wig, and makeup, according to the rule of assumptions, I would then assume, that is a woman. It doesn't take into account the possibility of someone being transgendered or that they're heading towards a Halloween party or something else. But by making assumptions, Manquiv and other economists of his ilks believe we do understand the world better. He argues that the art in scientific thinking is deciding which assumptions to make. Here's a famous illustration of this point. The guy over to the left, well, they're looking at a giant number. The guy over to the left is looking at what he perceives to be the number 6. The person over to the right is perceiving that is the number 9. Based on a general assumption, both are correct. But the art of scientific thinking is deciding which assumption to make. So in this case, there needs to be context. That could be the number 9 or the number 6 until you take a look and see that it's part of a series in, let's say, a parking garage. And you see next to this number 6, a number 7, and a number 8. Well, excuse me, a number 8 and a number 10. And this 6 or 9 between them, you, of course, would know it's a 9. So, again, it's how to make an assumption based upon educated guesses, but also on decisions based on context. And lastly, on the role of assumptions, they use different assumptions to answer different questions. As you'll see later on, when we look at different economic situations and scenarios in the future, it is only through the assumptions that they make about how the economy works or how people act or behave that then we can make predictions that are more truthful than, let's say, making things up. So one of the great questions for debate is whether or not economics is a hard or a soft science. And this might be something that I might put on a short answer or an essay question, or perhaps on your quick quiz that you'll be doing on Friday, on Thursday. Is it a hard science like biology and physics, or is it soft science like, let's say, history or psychology or something like that? Graduates of, let's say, the Chicago Business School will say it's a hard science. Others who are more social sciences will say no, it has as much flaws as the other sciences because there's no way really to discern the information. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all. Wasn't that quick? So for next time, you are going to have quiz number 1, that's going to be covering just pages 20 to 22, covering the material presented. So that would be the material on the introduction and the section on the economist as a scientist. And as I mentioned before, it is open book, it is open note. So, I mean, how on earth can anyone complain about that? All right, so that makes this the end of part 1.